We're really excited to have a series of panels today. And on many of these panels, we have folks who have written papers for today. You've got them in your hands, I hope, or they were outside if you haven't. And what we're going to do through the course of the day is talk a little bit about the past and present when it comes to content knowledge and core knowledge, and then move our way as we think more and more towards the future. So this first panel, which is a fantastic panel, is going to talk about basically the past and present of content knowledge. So we have first Ruth Wattenberg, one of the famous former editors of the American Educator, as Saul mentioned, that has been publishing works by and about Don for many years, who's going to in her paper, we gave a chance to dig into some of the history here, as well as some of the data to say, what does it look like when you go back as far as a nation at risk and then walk your way forward? What has the state of content knowledge been, both at the elementary school level and a little bit in the high school? So she's going to talk about a few of the findings from there. Then we've got Dan Willingham, who you heard on the video, is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, one of the nation's leading cognitive psychologists, cognitive scientists. And Dan's going to tell us, what, well, come on, you're very, yes. And he's going to explain to us what have we learned since cultural literacy about the cognitive science on content knowledge, on the importance of knowledge, and how this connects and how children learn. And so help us bring us up to speed on that. And then Valerie, as you know, again from the video, principal of PS 124, did I get that right? In New York City, one of the first adopters of the core knowledge program, and has stuck with it through 15 years. And I can only imagine all of the ups and downs in New York City over that time, what it must have taken with all the different cast of characters and reforms to be able to keep core knowledge in place at that one wonderful elementary school. So we're going to hear about Valerie's experience as a principal, putting this into action and what that has meant over time. All right, so we're going to give some time for some opening comments, and then we'll get into a discussion. So Ruth, start us off. Tell us about the state of content knowledge and how that has changed over time. Are schools teaching content knowledge, and has that improved?
No and no, at least at the elementary grades, and I'm really going to focus on the elementary grades. And I do want to say my main qualification for being here, I think, is that as editor of American Educator, I think I published Don more than any other author. So anyway, the condition of content now and in the past, it's bad. The neglect of content really is staggering. And while all of you are experts, I actually think I might be able to stun even you about how bad it is. And I really am going to focus just on the elementaries. I'm also told to do exactly 10 minutes, which I hope you'll hold me to, so I'm going to go very quickly, and if you want to come back, we can. All right. I want to start where really Saul and actually the video left off, which is, so we have the Common Core standards. They have such a strong commitment to knowledge and to teaching it coherently, but they are mainly English language arts standards. They are essentially content-free. And there are 300 plus standards in there, depending how you count, for skills of reading, writing, listening, things like identify who is telling the story, explain how the author uses reason and evidence, and so on. And so point one is the staggering lack of content. Point two is that despite this commitment to the content, the implementation of the Common Core so far is not focused on that, I would say, at all. It is focused on these 300 skill standards, the implementation of them. And I want to give some evidence on each point. First, on the current and historic neglect. There's not a lot of data on this. People don't study elementary schools, and as I point out in the paper, the nation at risk barely even mentioned it. But what we can look at from some studies is how many minutes per day are spent on science and social studies. And in 2012, the total content time for science and social studies in grades K to 3 is 35 minutes a day. So I can see some stunned faces. It's really quite remarkable. In grades 4 to 6, when in theory reading instruction is well or beyond that, it's slightly more, it's 45 minutes a day for both of them together. So this is not a time where you're going to teach a coherent, substantial, rich content curriculum, obviously. The subject that does get a lot of time is reading, English language arts. In 2012, in the lower primary grades, 90 minutes a day went to reading, and in the upper grades, it was barely less. It was 83 minutes. And let me just very quickly, the numbers I've given you pretty much are what they were in 1977. This has not changed a lot. There was a spike up in about 2000, and then presumably because of the No Child Left Behind emphasis on reading and so on, and other similar initiatives, it went back down. So this is the culture, this is the ingrained practice, it's not new. So in theory, reading could be a time to learn knowledge, right? We learned in the video this morning and from Don, reading is based on knowledge. But that's not what happens. Reading time is, the spine of it is mainly the elementary reading books. And we can look at those books and see what's the content, what's being taught here. And again, I want to go back 30 years ago. In 1983, Bill Schmidt, who many of you know from math studies, actually conducted a study on what was in the elementary textbooks. And what he found then, 42% of the reading selections had no content at all, none. And if you're wondering what that means, what could that possibly look like? I'm going to give you an example from a subsequent study. 20% had social science content, but a third of that was what he called social themes, such as growing up, living with family members, getting along with your friends. Not a lot. In 2003, 20 years later, Kate Walsh, who's sitting right in front of me, did a piece for the American Educator where she reviewed 5 of the popular textbooks at the time, and she found, and I quote, she found mainly incoherent, banal themes, okay, specifically, quote, only one story in one of the books departed from the simple world of family and friends and themes of sharing, playing, and family celebrations. One. And then, this is my favorite, this morning there's a lot of discussion about background knowledge. And in these books, they kind of got that point. You're supposed to build background knowledge. And 2 of the stories where they emphasized building the background knowledge were for the teddy bear story, so that you would ask, what do teddy bears look like? We want to build that knowledge before we read about it. And what makes grandmothers special? And I also want to say, talking about content-free, what would that look like? My favorite, which Kay pointed out, was the story called Toaster Time. So there you go. All right. Clearly, the status quo, yeah, that's when she switched fields, right? Clearly, the status quo condition of knowledge is neglected. Let me go quickly to point 2, that there's no evidence that the implementation of Common Core standards is addressing this, despite the fact that clearly it's the intent of the standards that it should be addressed. Let me just say, I reviewed a lot of news coverage. I read the major reports on Common Core implementation. I looked at a lot of state websites, and then I carefully looked at the second grade textbooks that are now Common Core aligned. So what did I find? First, I see no evidence of any states or large districts, except for New York State, revamping their early grades curriculum, expanding the time in that curriculum to content subjects, integrating in some big way more content into the curriculum. And let me say, I don't see it in secondary either. I didn't closely look at that, but I don't think it's there either. Second, unless the state actually put the full Common Core document online and posted it, and many didn't, many only put on the 300+ skill standards. If they didn't have the whole document, most of them don't even say that to read at these high levels, you need more content knowledge than kids are getting. It's not there. Third, what the states are focused on is the 300+ standards. There's crosswalks between old standards and new standards, Lexile information on books so they can meet the text complexity standards. Many states have posted exemplar lessons so that you can see exactly how to use these standards in an English language arts lesson. Some also have exemplars showing how to incorporate these standards into the content subjects. But these are what I call one-offs, sort of drive-by content. It's sort of, today we're going to learn about frogs, and next week we'll learn about, Native American medicine or something. And there's no coherence, nothing is built, it's just one-offs. Okay, quickly, onto the textbooks. Many changes were made to incorporate the 300 plus standards, for example, and some of this, I saw this, it was also reported in Ed Week by Stephen Sawchuk. There are more questions in these textbooks that ask kids to get evidence from the text. Fewer ask for student opinions, a very good move. One text added some domain vocabulary words, which is good, but it was like 3 or 4 per chapter, and they weren't really on domains because they weren't domains. There's more nonfiction, again, meeting one of the Common Core standards, but it's really amazing how insubstantial and random you can make your nonfiction. One story was on how to make s'mores. Another was the true story of a man rescued by a dog. And let me say, I'm not saying these are all horrible stories. That was a good story. But it's not building coherent knowledge. And I'm going to really run through this last part to be done. But I looked in every book to see what grains of content, a fact, a theme, a concept, an idea, was repeated at least twice in one unit and then once more ever in the year. In text 1, one topic met that threshold. In text 2, about a dozen topics reached it, but keep in mind how thin the content could be to reach that threshold. The example I'm going to give is they learned about an immigrant by 1, the definition of immigrant. Second, immigrants came to the U.S. for work or family. That was repeated in a couple of places. And there was a story about a girl who had just arrived in the U.S., and so we learned that that is very lonely. Nothing else. Oh, and that there were a lot of immigrants in Texas. You'll be interested to know, for those of you who follow Texas adoption, textbook adoption. And in one book, there was actually one theme that was well developed. And I'll just say, in core knowledge, 12 themes get well developed in second grade.
And it's never about s'mores.
And it's never about s'mores.
Wow. All right. Well, so Ruth, this is first of all incredibly depressing. So thanks for that. Talked about Chuck and I talked about we need to start offering uppers to people for our reports and things so that they're not so depressed. This is going to be a theme today. We've got this great opportunity with Common Core. It clearly states that districts need to adopt a content-rich curriculum, and yet we see no evidence of that message getting through. And the question we're going to keep coming back to today is how can we change that? What do we need to do to shout it from the mountaintops to get this word across? The materials that you've looked at, you think these are textbooks and things that have come out fairly recently. This is not just the cynically, was 2010 they slapped the label on it. These publishers probably really do think their stuff is Common Core aligned.
Well, they certainly say it's Common Core aligned. 2 of them actually say it on the book, and they're right here. You can look at them. And the third, if you go on the website, this is the version that they are selling as Common Core aligned, and they believe it is.
Is that a puppy on the cover?
I think it's a fox.
Ah.
And I'll just say, you can see this is Journey's Common Core. This is the brand new Common Core. It's definitely pitched as this is Common Core. So.
All right. Okay. We're going to come back to a lot of these things. Dan. All right. Now help us understand. I think all of us in this room know that Don discovered the cure for cancer 30 years ago, right? And there's been more and more evidence of this as time has passed. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I want to start by mentioning my reaction when cultural literacy first came out, because my position was a little bit different than probably anyone else here. I was a graduate student studying cognitive psychology. So like so many other people, I went into a bookstore and saw this book and heard a lot of people were reading it, so took it home and read it and was delighted to find this chapter 2, right? So the introduction sort of gives you an overview of the book, and then the very first chapter that really dives in, it was a review of what we know about attention, what we know about memory, what we know about reading comprehension, And it pulled it together in a way that a lot of it was familiar to me as a student of cognitive psychology, but pulled together in a way that I had not seen. And so I thought, God, this English professor is really quite a good cognitive psychologist. And it's an opinion I still hold, actually. So that was very much the way I read the book and continue to see the book is this is I think the missing link for when we say that people don't understand cultural literacy. It's because they sort of bleep over chapter 2, which is really the mainspring for the whole thing. So what is the cognitive psychology that was present in cultural literacy? Well, we had lots of data that people with broad background knowledge were better readers than people with narrow background knowledge. The mechanism for that was a little less clear. People at the time were very focused on the fact that communication always has gaps in it. You don't spell out absolutely everything that is necessary to make logical connections. Instead, you're gambling that the person you're writing for or speaking to has some of that knowledge in their head, and you can safely omit it. So for example, a writer might write, Tricia spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag. Now, there's assumed knowledge there. You're assuming that the reader knows when you spill coffee, it kind of makes a mess. People don't really like messes, and rags can clean up a mess. And so now the causality between jumping up to get a rag and the spilled coffee becomes plain. What happens if you're missing that knowledge? I'll give you another example. The researcher saw that the data distribution was perfectly symmetrical. She called her assistant to come to her office. If you don't know that data distributions are never perfectly symmetrical, then you're in trouble. And you're also probably in trouble if you don't know that researchers typically don't collect their own data. Their assistant would do that. And so if you know that, then it makes sense. She's calling the assistant in because something is not right, and she wants an explanation. So that was sort of our understanding in the late 1980s about why background knowledge was so important. I'll tell you just a couple of things that have happened within cognitive psychology since that time that have led to a richer understanding of this main finding that people with broad background knowledge are so much better at reading than people who don't lack that knowledge. One is that even when you understand a text, so background knowledge is not necessary for comprehending the text, for jumping those gaps that have been left in by a reader. Background knowledge can color your understanding of a text, influence how you think about it. So I'll give you an example of that. Here's a paragraph for you to listen to. Carol Harris was a problem child from birth. She was wild, stubborn, and violent. By the time Carol turned 8, she was still unmanageable. Her parents were very concerned about her mental health. There was no good institution for her problem in her state. Her parents finally decided to take some action. They hired a private teacher for Carol. Now, what if I later told you, or had told you beforehand, Carol Harris was actually a pseudonym that was occasionally used for Helen Keller. Now, a lot of the paragraphs, not that you needed that background knowledge to understand the paragraph. The paragraph is perfectly comprehensible to you when you didn't have that knowledge, right? But now it's going to color your interpretation of a lot of what I said. Suddenly the fact that she's wild, stubborn, and violent takes on a very different tone. Now you understand, well, that's probably coming from frustration of not being able to communicate, right? So the person who has never heard of Helen Keller, even if it said Helen Keller, their understanding of that paragraph is always going to be what yours was when I named it, just used the name Carol Harris. So this is one way in which we've, since the late 80s, have come to understand that background knowledge is so important to comprehension. Even if you're able to jump all the gaps that the writer has left in, background knowledge is still playing a role because it's influencing and sort of coloring the way that you interpret the bits and pieces of the text. I'll give one other example of a finding that I think is very important to our discussion today. And that's the ability of readers to use cues within the text to fill in those gaps that I was talking about. So can't you just, when you're reading a text and you come across something you don't understand, can't you just reason it out? Well, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. Like the data distribution example I gave before, I think you probably couldn't very easily. But there are times that you can. So here's a nice example from one reading researcher named Walter Kinch. The wind was calm, so they used Kevlar sails. Well, if you're like me, I mean, I don't know very much about sailing, but I know minimally enough so that when I listen to it, I'm like, well, okay, Kevlar, I know that sails are generally made of fabric. Kevlar must be a type of fabric, and for some reason that I don't really know, Kevlar must be especially suitable for sailing when the winds are calm. So sure, you can do that. And in fact, that's one of the great pleasures of reading, right? You're learning new things. The question is, how much tolerance do you actually have for doing that? Because it really slows you down, and it's, that kind of problem solving is actually kind of effortful. So this has been an active topic of research over the last 15 or 20 years. And there's actually a percentage that people have come up with in terms of vocabulary, not in terms of background knowledge, but there is a reasonably agreed upon percentage of vocabulary words you need to know before you're going to get frustrated and will likely quit. I'll ask you to think for a moment. What would you guess that number is? What percentage of words do you think people need to know before, if it dips down, they start to get frustrated? It's 98%. 98%. I tried this at schools, and typically teachers guess around 93, something like that. It's 98%. Of course, it's going to vary depending on your motivation to read the text. But when you think about it another way, it's not that surprising, right? Think about a page of text. There's probably about 300 words or so on that. Lots of those are repeats. You've got 100 or 150 unique words. So if you're talking about 98%, that means on every page of text, there's 2 or 3 words that you don't know. That actually sounds like a lot, right? So the moral of this little bit of research is, yes, of course you can use cues within the text to figure stuff out, which is frequently the plea when people talk about skills. They say, well, you know, you've got to recruit strategies. We've got to teach them metacognitive strategies. Absolutely you should. Absolutely it's a good idea. That's only going to get you so far because deploying those strategies is very demanding of attention, and it can be, it's not always going to work, can be frustrating, and people are only going to do so much of it. And so you're much better off just knowing things rather than trying to work them out as you go.
Okay. Very well said, Dan. Do you see any evidence that you've been writing about this? You've been writing a lot in American Educator. A lot of shout outs for American Educator today. Mm-hmm. Well deserved.
Yeah, and Lisa was my successor now at Cornell.
You know, do you see any evidence, though, that this cognitive science has influenced the field in any measurable way?
So,
sorry to depress you there, Dan.
Can I have some uppers before I
answer that? Any impact?
I don't want uppers. I want a drink is what I really want. Are we doing Bloody Marys this morning? Oh, so I think it's creeping along. I think, and again, in no small part to the willingness of American Educator, which I think has really been the mainstay of teacher publications that has been trying to get this information in front of teachers. I think there's a lot of work to be done.
All right, but when you look at those 2 books right there on the table, and you think, why haven't the people writing those books been more influenced by what has been found in cognitive science? Do you have any hypothesis for why that might be?
Yeah, and so the education is not unique in that you've got basic researchers and then you've got practitioners. And what the basic researchers are learning is relevant to practice. What makes education different is that in many fields that have this relationship, medicine is a standard example, but it's true of architecture, it's true of accounting. I learned recently, a friend of mine's an accountant, like there's research in accounting? I thought they just had that all worked out, right? Now, we've got Excel, like what else do we, right? So turns out there's research in accounting. There's a little bit of background.
Change,
yeah,
right?
A little background knowledge I lacked. So what typically happens is the practitioners themselves self-organize and they create institutions that guarantee good lines of communication between researchers and practitioners, and also put in place some guarantees of quality. So the American Medical Association is very powerful, and if they indicate that a publisher is doing a terrible job, medicine, that there's going to be a lot of credibility there. teachers have not created institutions that do that. They've created institutions that do other things for practitioners, but not ensure not to ensure that credible science is going to come their way. So it's basically the Wild West. And teachers and administrators are left on their own to judge the scientific credibility of claims. And that's not something practitioners are expected to do in most other fields.
Okay, again, we'll come back to some of these themes. All right, so Valerie, you have been leading the school for, is it 15 years under Core Knowledge?
15 years.
So want to understand, how did you come to Core Knowledge? Tell us a bit about the sort of initial story and how the school organized.
The beginning journey.
And a little bit about just some of the challenges you have faced in keeping a Core Knowledge focus through all the tumult, I think Randy said, of the last 15 years.
15 years ago at PS 124, I was a teacher. I was the grant writer in the building. My former mentor and former principal, Elaine Thompson, is here. And I went to her one day and I said, you have great teachers and nothing's going on in your classrooms. Children, their test scores are marginal. Teachers are working 150%. Nothing's going on of concrete importance to make children become ongoing learners. At that time, there was a comprehensive school reform grant that New York State was putting out for failing schools. I've always been known as a little crazy, and I went to the principal and I said, okay, we're not a failing school, but we might be if we don't change. So I wrote the grants, and they were giving $50,000 a year, and then Ms. Thompson at the time went to the superintendent because all they wanted was Success for All or Roots for Wing, you know, that's what they wanted. And she pushed the grant because, and the superintendent came back and said, well, we're not going to send it in. And my father always told me the worst that someone could tell you was no. But when the superintendent said no, my other side came out, and I jumped up and down, and I said, what would it hurt to send it in? So we sent it into the state. We went for a review on it. We talked about Core Knowledge. It was one of the things that they put on their approved list of choices that you could go for, but they didn't think much of it. And we never heard about it again, and we were not going to hear about the grant until June. But then Ms. Thompson came to me and she said, you really believe in this? And I said, the staff really believes in this. And she gave me all her Title I money. And she said, okay, you believe in it? Make it happen. And I said, make it happen. Okay. Last day of school, we had set up summer institutes where teachers were coming all summer. She gave me all the Title I money. At that time, it was $200,000 that she set aside at that point, because at that point, there were only 500 children in the school. Today, we have 1,400 students at the school. We're at 160% overutilization. The last day of school, summer institutes are starting in a week. Ms. Thompson calls me in her office and says, I need to talk to you. The superintendent called. I said, okay, they're going to put a kibosh on this. This is over. They said, you got the grant. You got $763,000 for 3-year implementation. Now make it work. The district, who usually gets a lot of money, they only got $3,000 for processing, putting it in my budget. Now it was a 3-year commitment because effective reform takes 3 to 5 years. After the 3rd year, for sustainability, we pulled the Title I funding. At that point, I had become overnight, when I got the grant, core facilitator, assistant principal, and within 5 years, the principal when Ms. Thompson retired. First thing we did, first year, threw every textbook out. To this day, we don't have textbooks. Textbooks don't drive knowledge. They drive publishers and their bottom line. So to this day, we have no textbooks. But 15 years ago, before all the publishing companies like National Geographic and all the other companies came out with standalones, we really had to forage and say, how are we going to meet all of these topics and also train all of the teachers? It's been a 15-year journey. We have books on every readability level and every topic in the building. So when you walk in a classroom, and my class sizes are 32 to 35, my teachers never leave. The only time they leave is when they retire or they move out of state. Very low mobility rate on teachers. I'd say in my 15 years under Core Knowledge, only the fact that we've expanded to middle school have we hired a handful of teachers, and they stay. And they stay because they're committed to the work. But the work was hard, and it's not over. You know, every day, our motto in our school is, if you think you've arrived, it's time to leave. Because there is no end to knowledge. There is no end. But the commitment was now, when we first started, I had to go to Ms. Thompson and said, I want one thing from you, one word. And she looked at me because our styles were very different, but we were both on the same page. She said, okay, what's the word? I said, flexibility. She says, what does that mean? I said, flexibility. And what happened was, for the first 3 years, when something didn't work for a teacher, we said to the teacher, if it doesn't work for you, fine. Come to me and tell me what else you need. And that built a community and capacity for teachers to be ongoing learners. So at this juncture, what happened was 5 years, 6 years into this, the 6th year, they took my 5th graders out of the building. That would be their terminal grade. They were going to middle school. We tracked them for the year. They were all failing. Children that were achieving, they were bored, they weren't learning anything. We pulled them back into our building. So at this point, when we talk about, and I was listening to Ruth talk about how ELA and math is taught. Well, social studies and science, we have social studies and science teachers for every class, 5 days a week, an hour a day, besides the ELA. And that came with scheduling. Because the building is so big, I'm supposed to have 4 assistant principals. I only work with 2. Because it's not about us, it's about where we're going to get the funding to support the professional development for the teachers, professional development for the parents. And I say that parent development because we hit a brick wall when the parents started to feel threatened that their children knew more than them. But how are we going to pull the parents in? So we started parent institutes. So I'm open 6 days a week. 6 days a week, Saturdays. It's for all of those new children that have come into our school community. And we get an average of 300 additional children a year. That's the way it goes. And we do have children that leave. But those 300 coming in are coming in as empty vessels. The vase has no water in it. And we have to help them to catch up. I've had parents recently that said, I have to take my child out of your school because they're not supposed to learn like this. It's like they're in high school or college. But then they stay because we give the parents the support. We're committed to the journey. There have been a lot of new things that have come. The paradigm shifts every 6 months to a year. We hold them at bay. As a leader, my job is to see the things that are plausible and I know are going to have sustainability over time. And then dare to be different. That's another thing. That's a big sign over my door. Dare to be different and also whatever. And my superintendent has been very supportive. And she'll always say to me, I know your word is process, but change is process. And good change that's systemic is process over time. We have approximately 100 schools that come and visit us every year. And the people come and they sit and they go into classrooms. It's not about me. It's not about even the teachers. It's about what the children can tell you. The children can tell you a wealth of information, but they own that knowledge. They're proud of it. My special education has grown considerably because New York City now has what's called the shared path for success. All special education children now go to their home zone school, whether you have the program or not. And even though we have to make and meet their IEP goals, we're now meeting them through core knowledge more than ever before. And these children have a wealth of knowledge to say we've given them a voice because we're giving them concrete knowledge over time. We haven't gotten where we need to be. I'm looking forward to New York changing again. We're getting a new chancellor. I hope it's an instructional person. I hope it's someone that's going to come in and embrace core knowledge. Teacher evaluation has impacted upon us this year, all the change, but as a leader, it's my job to make the teachers not feel threatened and accepted. We do a lot of independent work on writing our own tasks. One thing does not define us. I'd say core knowledge defines us for everything. State testing doesn't define me. I don't do well with state testing. My children do incredibly well on content tests, incredibly well. The state will always call and say, okay, where did they know this from? ELA tests that are mindless, not so much, not so much. But we'll continue to be a work in progress. I'm hoping now with the Common Core that things are going to turn around and more schools are going to embrace coherent, sequential knowledge over time. But the biggest thing I'm hearing from people that come to visit us all the time is, it's too much work, and where do you get the time? 15 years of work. And for the first 3 years, we did the sequence for all grades, a third each year. So by the end of the third year, we were doing it, and every grade was doing it, and every teacher was doing it. And if you wanted to opt out, you needed to opt out at the end of the year and leave. But I never had anybody that left because of that. So that's my journey.
Wow. Thank you, Valerie. Yes, indeed. Incredible story. And also, I think you are the Yogi Berra of education here. You've got so many great great lines that I love. That's where I was going with that. All right.
But no, I think they call me crazy. The chancellor calls me
Yes.
crazy, but that's okay.
That is okay.
You need to be crazy.
Wow,
to
so
do
many
what's right
so
for
many
children.
things to unpack there. So let me, and again, I feel like we start to have some hints at why perhaps this hasn't spread further. You say it's a lot of work. Let's talk about the teachers. A lot of us wonder if all of a sudden we ask elementary school teachers to teach content, will they have the ability to do so? Will they know the content? How have you helped your teachers get where they need to be to teach this stuff?
We had to teach them. We had to challenge them. And the other thing is, which was incredible, by challenging them to learn and become ongoing learners, it became very competitive. When we first started, 70% really bought into it, 30% were the outliers. But what happened was, innate competition started to build. And what we did was we allowed people to say, okay, there are a lot of strands per grade. How are we going to break this up? Because there's an overwhelming amount of information to learn. So we allowed everybody to take a strand and plan across. That was initially. What I initially did was, at that time, there was Baltimore Curriculum Press, there were things from the Core Foundation. We ran off every lesson plan, because that was before the books came out, the teacher handbook came out. And we handed them to them that first summer institute. And they all looked at me like I was a green monster. And I said, what? And they said, we don't want this. We want to do it ourselves. So that was the key, that they were starting to take ownership. And it evolved over time. It has proven, though, that to train teachers takes time. And that comes past the schools. It's your districts, it's your superintendents, it's everything saying, we're going to give you the time. That's what's missing, the time. Teachers right now don't feel that they have time. Because of the high stakes testing, because now of the new teacher evaluation model, they don't feel that they can take chances. We have that core of knowledge that they already have. But now this year, I'm getting somewhat of a pushback. Well, how much more? Well, tell me how much more you need to be successful to take this next group of students. And then they dig in. So I carry a budget of $250,000 a year just for professional development. And that comes from in school, out school. You want to go to a conference, but then you must come back and turnkey it. And then there's another additional $200,000 that goes to after-school programs and for teachers to do curriculum planning to take them to the next level.
So, but in terms, when they're going to these professional development opportunities, then is it they can find things that are really content focused?
They find things that they can add to the cadre of things they're already doing.
Okay.
They're coming back and they're saying to me that they don't find the depth of information at the conferences that they need to take them to the next level. Because while we do core knowledge and that's our main frame of everything we do, we've expanded past core knowledge, because that's not the only knowledge you need. So when they're going to the conferences, we're finding less and less conferences that take them to the level. They're hearing about Common Core, but when you go to the Common Core standard professional developments, as you said before, it's not linked to a specific content area or program. And that's where it falls on deaf ears. They come back and say, okay, but how am I going to do this? How am I going to find specific evidence, or how am I going to do these projects? So, and the other thing is, at this point of our school year, we've just started December. When I walk into 90% of my classrooms, the children are now teaching themselves. The teachers have turned over the teaching. They will do a model lesson at the beginning of the week. The children will get an outline of where it's going. Let's say sixth grader was just doing ancient Greece. When I went to the class last week, every group in that class, and there's 7 tiered groups in that class, are working on a different aspect of ancient Greece, but they're the teacher. They're doing all the planning, all the work, all the assessments, and then they're jigsawing it out. So now they're owning their information and getting their information, so that makes a stronger community. And I'm seeing that across the school.
It does sound a lot harder than teaching s'mores.
S'mores is a big thing on the state test. You need to know that sequence of how to get that s'mores right.
Well, let's talk about the testing. I'm glad you brought that up, and maybe get Dan in here as well. So you say that you don't do that well on these ELA tests, and
This year was, and I'll just throw out, New York State redid the test, aligned to the Common Core. 4th grade test, 9 stories, in-depth stories, fiction, nonfiction, procedural, 9 in-depth stories, 55 questions, 65 minutes. Of course, no one could do that. My 8th grade, forget it. The adults in the building looked at the 8th grade and said, this is egregious. Give them 5 and let's see what they know. But nothing was really content specific enough that their prior knowledge would support them. So this year, my 4th grade, who had always been in the 80th percentile, came in at 30th percentile. I said, oh gosh. But then the whole city crashed. Took it with a grain of salt. Looked at their science test, which was a 3-day hands-on science test, written, multiple choice. 98.4% were level 4. I looked at my social studies. I looked at my 8th grade science. I looked at my 8th grade regents. And I'm having all my children pass regents and living environment regents, but they're not doing well on the ELA. Well, they have to know how to read. They have to know math. They have to do. So what's going on? There's a disconnect between the way the tests are being formed. It's an issue.
And Don's been writing about this, that these are content-free tests, in fact, designed to be content-free, that it would almost introduce some unfair bias if there was, it required content knowledge to do well in these tests, which is, again, right, you just can't square that circle. But Dan, so is there a theory out there, though, that if you do a core knowledge kind of thing, content knowledge, that you may not do well in these year-to-year reading tests that are looking at skills, but at some point, it will show up that kids will be stronger readers? I mean,
sure. Well, I mean, it all depends on the content of the test, right, and how the test is structured. Could you write a test where content knowledge doesn't really give you much of an advantage? Yeah, I think that would be possible if you put your mind to it. I mean, I'm not a psychometrician, but I mean, I've seen tests like that, and you also can teach. To some extent, you can teach kids strategies to hunt and gather information, so that they may not really understand what's in the 5 paragraphs all that well, but they've learned some strategies for how to look at the questions and then go up there and ferret out the information that's required.
So this is a big problem. So what's the alternative here? What should we be pushing for? I mean, obviously testing is driving so much of everything in education. So is it that we need different kinds of tests? Is it that we need to tell schools to be patient, that your elementary school ELA scores might not be great, but by the time they get to middle school, you're going to start to see an impact? What is the pitch? Because, and Ruth, I assume otherwise this does start to feel hopeless. How do we tell schools, well, do core knowledge or do content knowledge, but by the way, you're going to have terrible test scores?
So just a couple things, and they're not easy answers. They don't have an easy path. But oh wait, I'm sorry. Go. I just forgot exactly what I was going to say. On the content tests. So part of what Don has always called for is that we ought to test content every year, not even necessarily reading, but content every year. But it should be very low stakes. And so that what you're really providing people with is sort of some guidelines. Look, this is what you're going to get tested on, and it's not going to affect your evaluation. It's not going to lead to your school shutting down. But we're all going to know, you're going to know, your faculty is going to know, are they learning this stuff? Now, it requires some understanding at the level of the state agency that that's a worthwhile strategy. And I think that those people haven't been won over. And I think that's a very big part of the puzzle. And
in a sense, it requires a statewide curriculum at that point.
Right.
I mean, right.
I think that's the key point, and that was a point made by Don and Robert Pendicio in an article they wrote called "There's No Such Thing as a Reading Test" or something close to that. They said you can't test reading in the abstract because content is always woven in, and so if you want to test children's reading ability, you really also are testing their knowledge. And so for it to be fair, you need to test whatever it is they've been learning in the curriculum.
Now, Valerie, I do wonder, do you start to see over time that your students do better as they get older, and now that content knowledge really can help them on those tests?
They do remarkably better. They do remarkably better when they hit high school, because I'm constantly getting phone calls from high school principals and say, where did these children come from? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, Most of my children, about 72%, finish high school in the second year and are doing AP courses because they're coming into the high schools which are not where they need to be. They're coming into these high schools armed with a lot of content knowledge. I see children that have left us, those children that started that 15-year journey with us that are in college now or out of college. One of our former students, who was not a good student when he first came to us, embraced the sciences and the social studies. He just ran with it, and he went to Swarthmore, and in his second year of Swarthmore this past June, he passed away on an expedition in Costa Rica to find in the rainforest different plants that he was going to be putting into this scientific repository for people all around the world to do. And the last day that he was there, unfortunately, he drowned because there was no lifeguard and there was a riptide and he drowned. And when we went to his memorial service, so many of the students that had not only known him, but had gone past him were there and came back, and a group of the children were the children that would have in the past been labeled not going to succeed or limited by their poverty, that were doctors, lawyers, writers, researchers. One, this little young man, Stephen, who's still little, he was shorter than I, said, Miss Lewis, I made it to medical school and I'm in geriatric care. And I said, was that specifically for me? So when you say, do you see the improvement? Is it for all children? No, but it gives all of my children a voice. So I can say that it's done well by all children. And it's done well by us as learners because we're constantly being challenged. So I can say those 15,000 soldiers that I've put out, how many people have they met along the way? So when you see the ripple effect of just one school, what could thousands of schools? And that's where we're going to get.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Valerie. Thank you. Dan, I think I'm coming back to this theme again to say that I do worry. People will say, we should do more core knowledge, and they might say, well, is it in the What Works clearinghouse? Has it been proven to work? Is it effective? What kinds of studies could we design that could look at some of these long-term impacts? Because it seems like we're not going to see it in these content-free English ELA tests. So what other kinds of studies could we design that might detect?
Well, there are other outcomes other than standardized tests that kids are going to encounter as part of state or local requirements. There are lots of outcomes that you could care about. One, if you've really got time, you can look at career outcomes, you can look at dropout rates and so forth. One of the things that Don and I have talked a lot about over the years is the frustration that core knowledge has been so understudied. It's an unfortunate byproduct of the way research gets done. If you want a researcher to evaluate the implementation of the core knowledge sequence in a district, you're talking about at least 2 or 3 years of that person's life, of their professional life, and not doing much else. So the things that tend to get studied are things that are already in place, where it's like, no one knows anything about this. It's really time, and lots of people are doing it. So it's really time that we take a look at it. Persuading a researcher to study something that no one else is really doing but seems like a kind of a good idea, that's actually a pretty tough sell. So happily, I think we're maybe getting over the hump now because there is a substantive study in New York City. There's a major study in Colorado right now that's going to examine outcomes in core knowledge schools. So I think we're maybe getting there, and I'm very optimistic.
Okay, teacher evaluation. Again, how big a threat is this? If teachers feel like they have to get year-to-year gains in ELA, how big a problem is this?
Well, you can't do it. That's just flat out. I think Saul was right. If you're telling people they're going to be evaluated on doing this, you're not going to get them to do X. That's just not going to happen. So I think figuring that out is very important. And there's another piece on the testing that hasn't been talked about that I think is really, really important. And I see this in my kids' schools in D.C. So many schools, districts now use these benchmark tests. And so every 10 weeks, your kids are getting tested. And the benchmark tests are connected to the end-of-year test. It's all skills. Or what I should say is what comes out of it is a diagnosis based on skills. So when your child doesn't do well on it, or your class doesn't do well on it, they kind of go backwards to restudy how to find the evidence, or to restudy finding the main topic. And it's really crippling the classrooms. So you got to get the test right, but these benchmark tests, I frankly think they're a great idea in principle, you know, this idea that you're testing as you go, but if they're not connected to what you really want to teach, obviously it's yet one more impediment.
I'm talking to a friend who's been out in the field looking at some districts that are supposedly doing a good job implementing the Common Core, and yet they have these benchmark exams. They've been in place for several years. They have not changed to be aligned with the Common Core, and they just keep churning on. And so, you know, the districts don't stop doing what they were doing before. They just keep doing it. And the teachers say, well, Common Core, whatever, I'm accountable to these benchmark exams. So that's what I'm focused on. And that's getting in the way of moving forward on anything else.
I would just want to add something to that. I mean, one of the great dangers in evaluating teachers by student progress is that teachers are not going to be motivated to do anything that is not going to contribute to performance at the end of the year. In other words, why should I teach them something that's not on the year-end test but might really benefit them 2 or 3 years down the road? That is really true in spades of the core knowledge sequence. Because if you look in early grades, reading tests in early grades are mostly about decoding, right? That's what kids are learning to do at that grade. So it would seem apparent that that's what you should be testing. But the background knowledge that we're talking about is all of a sudden going to appear around grade 4 or so on the reading tests, because there's not much point in testing decoding in grade 4. Most kids are quite good decoders and they would do very well. So now they become comprehension tests. Now background knowledge is much more important. And so if you haven't been building background knowledge from pre-K through grade 4, the children are going to have a lot of trouble. So where's the motivation for teachers in those early grades to take time away from decoding instruction to make sure that knowledge is being built?
Okay, I want to get all of you into this discussion. Michelle's got a microphone, so raise your hand if you have a question or a very brief comment. We'll allow those today.
Will be tolerated.
We will tolerate those today, yes, since we have such an esteemed audience as well. Did you have something, Ruth, you wanted to say?
I just want to say, in saying what I said, I don't think it's just that teachers are cynics. I don't think that at all. Teachers are very much their practitioners. They have some ideas about what to do, and they're given tools. They're given this textbook. They're given these benchmark tests. So I don't want to suggest they're cynical, but they're doing what they're asked to do, and that's what they get graded on.
Okay, Mark.
Ruth, you mentioned when you were talking about the textbooks that some states have put up the accompanying materials in Common Core, the appendices and the exemplary text exemplars, many of them just the standards. And it seems to me the accompanying materials are where we have a lot of that knowledge assertion, text complexity. Do those materials just, you found, have no authority, no binding factor for many of the states?
No, actually, let me say, the appendices, some states don't even put up the appendices. They only put up the kind of 300 plus standards.
Which surely has nothing to do with the bluest eye being in the appendix, right? Right, okay.
But some put up right, because they get controversial. But some put up the appendices. But the stuff that's pro-content, that's not in the appendices. That's in kind of the rhetoric, the narrative, the surrounding sidebars. Yeah, and so that, I would say, in most cases, actually does not get onto these websites at all. And something like text complexity is, I would say it's content related, but it's kind of content free, you know? And that's true of a lot of these related things to the Common Core. They try a lot to be contenty, but they can't.
Okay, any others? Let me ask while you're raising your hand, Valerie, all this stuff that, Saul kind of talked about in the early days, these culture wars and the dead white men and this, I mean, is that just in the past? I mean, do your teachers, is that a part of the discussion at all, this worry about whose knowledge is it and who gets to decide what's important?
No, because it initially that was the conversation when we first bought into it. But the issue was that core knowledge was not the be-all, end-all. It was the beginning of that search for knowledge. So there were no barriers to where you could go with it. So we never focused on that. We just let people run with first the whole quark sequence, and then there were no boundaries. And so we've never had that problem.
Okay, other comments, questions? Yeah, we've got to use the mic. We've got to use the mics because of the video, as we say. Thank you.
This is a question that relates to Ruthie's pessimism and Dan's observation and answer to the question about why is this happening? And you used the AMA analogy and talked about how research doesn't get translated over into practice. When I was with the Shanker Institute, a number of people in this room signed this statement. We built what was really an implementation strategy on Don's ideas. And we talked about what you'd have to do if you had a core curriculum with assessment, with professional development, with the kids who were falling behind, with a whole array of things. But one of the things we said in there was that you needed to have an entity that was professionally run, research-driven, that would make judgments about what was being done in terms of a core curriculum and getting through on it. And Checker supported it, as I recall, with some variations. And we, and, you
Our
know,
friends on the right point that out almost every day.
people came to us after the Shanker Institute came out with this thing and said, okay, so what are you going to do about it? Great idea. When is this going to happen? And we weren't equipped to do that. And I just wonder, it seems to me that, I mean, Don has brought this thing a tremendous way, but we don't have a framework, a strategy for implementation on this. And I think, as you know, Ruth's reports are going to be repeated over and over again until people are too worried that this or that state's going to drop out when it gets scared about what it's doing. Does anybody have any thought about this?
Yeah, and by the way, this is a great question. We're going to keep coming back to this throughout the day. But yeah, and any questions on, especially how do you build a system around this so it's not just an individual school here or there?
Where judgments get made.
Where judgments get made.
So I don't have an answer on the system, but I do think that somebody ought to promote and commission studies of the content in different states, in what's being taught, whether it's the textbooks in particular. And you don't need to have a specific content curriculum that you judge it against. You can say the Common Core standards say you have to study content. And so you can look. Is there a set of domains? Do they lead somewhere? How many topics get studied? So I think there's a way for people to do evaluations of the Common Core standards that take this into account. And I hope that happens.
And we at Fordham are working on trying to find at least some of the exemplars out there. And by the way, Washington, D.C. looks like one of them that is also developing a very content-based curriculum. All right, one last comment or question very quickly.
It might be a follow-up to what Valerie said. The idea of when you own the development of the curriculum based off the sequence versus taking the materials that the foundation is now developing, what becomes the difference in terms of the professional development and the staffing and the interest in it? In other words, by taking that ownership, does that, because the 1,000 schools have all mostly had some degree of ownership of it because they weren't operating off CKLA. So it's just something for us all to be thinking about, this, the professional development and that importance. And you touched on it, that ownership was important.
I think looking across just education across the country, there's no commitment for long-term change. There has been too much change. It's not well thought out change. And just as teachers, leaders are also, they're being challenged. They want that number on a test. And until you can prove and show the work, so if you dare, and I said it earlier, if you dare to be different and show what can happen, you have to keep that focus and that commitment. I'm seeing, though, with my own colleagues, I had 14 colleagues, experienced colleagues, walk out in August. Walk out. And I said, where are you going? They said, we're finished.
These are principals?
Principals walked out of good schools. And the people that are replacing them, while they might have potential in the future, of the 14 people that replaced them, only 2 have ever been educators. Only 2. So they're looking at, as the principalship now, and leadership as the CEO, And you can run a budget, but if you don't know instruction, you can't walk that walk. So what we're seeing now is, and I'm hoping in New York, in the dialogue that I've been hearing in the next few weeks, that people are going to stand up and say, okay, we have to make this Common Core work. We have to make testing work. We have to make this new teacher evaluation work. But maybe they're going to be more than going to realize that it's not going to work unless they take a stand. And that's the people that are older like I are pushing that, because people are coming to us say, well, how are you making it work? Teacher evaluation for me has been a nightmare. And it's a nightmare, not because my teachers are not used to being in the room, I'm in the room all the time. But now they don't know how that information is going to be used, because now it's on a website. And when they did teacher value added 12 years ago in New York, and they realized that the data was wrong, they never pulled back the reports on those teachers where the data was wrong. So there's a big issue going on now. I have 800 informal observations to do, besides everything else. 800 informals, 150 initial planning conferences, 150 end-term conferences, and everything has to be put online. And to put it on correctly, to protect your teachers, and using the Danielson model, which is a whole other discussion, takes an hour. An hour for each 15-minute observation if you're going to do that teacher justice and support their practice. Because in the end, to support their practice is to move forward. So I think that until the states start to pull back with teacher value added and labeling everybody based on data that's not necessarily accurate either, or until, as Don said earlier, they come up with an accurate testing tool that doesn't change constantly, then we're going to know where we need to go. So I don't have an easy answer.
All right, well, please thank our wonderful first panel. Got us started.